Welcome, everybody, to the Wines of Tuscany. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history, the regions, and the grapes. My name is Rebecca, and I am here in Florence. Actually, that beautiful view is just a couple of minutes walk from my office. Or let's just say I'm at the wine shop, because we here in this little place, we have 30 different activities at the moment. We do grape tours. Grape tours is a small tour operator that I run with my husband. We do tours into the Tuscan countryside, to a lot of the regions that you're going to be learning about today. And we also do tours in Provence, from Nice in France. Besides that, we take our lucky guests on trips around Italy and France. So there's several trips scheduled throughout the year where we go, for example, to Sicily or to Bordeaux, to Champagne. We go visit some of the best wineries to learn about the different regional grapes and traditions and culture. We also have a little wine shop here at our place. In fact, you can see it behind me. We do some shipping of wines, so you can go and look at our social media or go to the website. Again, I'm going to link those underneath the video. And at the Italian Wine Institute, which is also here, we do wine tasting classes, classes like this one about the Tuscan wines or the Italian wines, and we do also the Wine Scholar Guild courses, Unit 1, Unit 2, and also the Italian prep course online. So do check out our stuff, and I hope you enjoy this little presentation that I'll start promptly. So I'm starting with a lovely painting from the late 1600s that I adore, because it's one of the first really realistic depictions of grape varieties. In fact, this painting, which is called 37 Grapes, is hanging in the Villa Medicea, Poggio a Caiano, and was commissioned by Cosimo Medici III, who I'm going to tell you more about on the next slide. And Bartolomeo Bimbi, who was a still life artist, he did a lot of those, wrote down also the names of the varieties, which is really cool. For example, over here on the left-hand side, will that be your right-hand side? I'm not quite sure. Anyway, over here, where my mouse is the Sangiovese grape that we're going to be talking about quite a lot today. But on we go. I think, there we go. Because I want to take you a little bit deeper into history. Now, I don't want this to be a history lesson or anything. Besides, I'm not a historian. But just to give you some background to see how we got to and why we got to what we're doing today. So the Etruscan Civilization is the first one that we can really associate with vineyards and wine. The grapevines at the time were not grown in a monoculture way like we see them today, but they were grown onto fruit trees, and basically it was mixed farming. So you'd have a few vines, you'd have some olive trees, some fruit trees, and veggies, and whatever you needed, but it wasn't specialized in that sense. So in Italian, they call it maritato, when a vine grows onto something, like having a husband that clings to you, basically. So the Roman Empire comes along and absorbs the Etruscan settlements in central Italy. They take wine with them wherever they go, and since they go all around, really thanks to the Romans, the European and Mediterranean vineyards just expand enormously during their empire. The Romans understand the importance of site and also have specific favorites. We could call them crus almost. So they priced their wines according to where the vineyards were simply giving better results. So quite similar to today. They were using amphora for the shipping of wine around the Mediterranean, and they did a lot of shipping. In Rome, there is a hill called Testaccio, where archaeologists have found a lot of broken amphora, a testimony to how the shipping of amphoras from different places is quite amazing. So they would date, and they would also put the place of origin on their bottlings, let's say. There's a curious fact about an addition of something called garum. Garum was this bizarre mix of honey, different kinds of herbs, and anchovies. And this paste would be used in the cuisine, but apparently also added to wine, which is quite funny. And of course, Bacchus at this time was the wine god. So always divine. We get to the Middle Ages and subsequently the Renaissance in Florence. At this time in Tuscany, we're under the feudal system. So the way the countryside is organized is that the nobility owns everything, and the farmers don't. They work the land. And so 50% of whatever they can make on a podere, which is a little farm where they would live, they would have to give to the landlord. And the other 50%, of course, they could keep for their family. So we're talking mixed farming once again. At this time, wine is produced more like a field blend. Whatever is around the house, they would put together. And the focus was on quantity, not quality, because of course the farmers wouldn't get paid more if the wine was better. The part of the produce that the nobility got was taken into town. Here in Florence, all the nobility had huge palaces they would live in. And on the bottom floor, you can find these wine windows. And there are hundreds of them. You just take a stroll out of the door and you'll start, seeing them as you walk along on the street. These wine windows were used to sell wine or even other farm produce like prosciutto and formaggio, so cheese, vegetables and whatnot. But we call them wine windows, and they do fit exactly a fiasco. So, the wicker basket bottle that Chianti used to be bottled in. And so there were also rules for when you could sell your wine. So it had to be during daylight between 9 and 5. And you couldn't sell to certain people. So you could not sell to prostitutes and thieves. We get the Guild of Winemakers in Florence, Arte dei Vinatieri, which means that winemaking and wine trading is a well-recognized part of the city life and economy. And so it's not one of the major guilds of Florence, but it is certainly important, thankfully, because it is today as well. Tuscany becomes a Grand Duchy in the mid-1500s. So all of the different villages that used to be independent city-states get annexed to Tuscany. And it is, of course, the Medici family that is at the head of it. So the Grand Dukes until the 1700s are Medicis. And that takes me to the date 1716, where something really important happens for wine in Tuscany, and really one of the first times that wine is regulated by law ever in the world. So we get this bando that Cosimo Medici III is the maker of. The bando basically describes 4 different regions in Tuscany that produce wine and their boundaries, their geographical area. In 1861, Italy becomes a country, and Tuscany becomes part of the Kingdom of Italy. But it doesn't change the fact that in the countryside, we still have and use the sharecroppers. In the 1880s, we get the first written documentation about specific wines like Chianti and Brunello. Barone Bettino Riccasoli of the Castello di Broglio writes down that he's using Sangiovese, Canaiolo, Malvasia, and Trebbiano, so a blend. In Montalcino, it's Ferruccio Biondisanti, who writes down that he's using only Sangiovese in his area. After the Second World War, so we're jumping a little, finally, with the Republic of Italy, the sharecropping system is banned. And there's a real shift in the countryside, of course. At this point, the nobility is not the only one that can own land, and so we get a real shift of ownerships in the areas. At this point, we also have the introduction of the tractor, which means that people can start to specialize and to do monoculture for the first time since Roman times, basically. This means that there's definitely a requirement for regulation because people did not have very much of a clue of how to produce high quality. In fact, in the past, it was always about quantity. And so things needed to change. We needed to get better definitions of what the different regions should represent. So it was decided to add a regulative system, very similar to the French one called the AOC, but we, of course, had to change it a little bit and called it the DOC. So starting in the 60s, the regions that were already well known for their produce of wine got these appellations that they had to respect. So basically by government law. The DOC stands for Designation of Origin, which is controlled. It is something you'll find on the label if, of course, the wine is from such a region. And behind it, there is the origins of the geographical region, but not only, there's also the whole culture of how the wine was made. So it has to do with the kind of grapes that are grown in the region, whether the wine can be a blend or not, also aging requirements for the wines, etc., etc. DOCG, so this elevation to a wine which is also guaranteed, has happened to 76 regions in Italy. So we have 76 of them throughout the boot. And it's a little bit more prestigious, but it's also a little bit more controlled. In fact, wines will have this fascetta that goes around the neck of the bottle, which is a government approval, basically. So wineries will get this little fascetta, this little sticker to put on their wines once the wine has been approved of by a chemical analysis, but also by a wine tasting commission. The important thing to understand with the DOCs and DOCGs is that what we're looking to do with them is to protect regions and their produce and to make sure that there is a specific standard and that there is a sort of typicalness or typicity in those wines, that they taste of their region so that they can't be imitated very easily in other areas. This, of course, was also a little bit limiting because there are very rigid rules for how the wines have to be produced, and not always were these rules in place to produce high-end wines. And so some winemakers got a little frustrated with them and started to produce wines that were not DOC and DOCG. And some of them got a little bit famous. So these wines were referred to in the past as Super Tuscans. They were typically blends of international grape varieties. So a little bit imitational towards Bordeaux for a while, using also a lot of French oak barrels that were not really common before in Italy. So the government finally gets around and starts to say, okay, you don't have to label these wonderful wines as table wines anymore. we will give you a specific, a little bit more of an elevated appellation. Now remember that the IGT is a catch-all, so not all IGT wines are super Tuscan wines or anything like that. They are free wines, so wineries are allowed to use the grapes they want. They don't have to follow a specific method. They don't have to try to achieve a specific taste that is of the region. So really it is a free-for-all, and you have great wines, you have mediocre wines, not that many I hope, but you have just all sorts, and it's quite a fun appellation for the wineries, I think. So the location, we are in the center of Italy, and just at the beginning of where the boot goes into the Mediterranean. So north of us, we have the Apennine mountain range, which crosses the whole northern border of Tuscany and then goes down through the boot all the way down to Sicily. We're on the sea as well, which is super important for our climate. And so it's the Tyrrhenian Sea that is right in front of us, with some lovely islands, as you can see. And just to the north, we touch the Ligurian Sea. And we're between the 42nd and 44th parallels, which is amply inside of where winemaking can happen, which of course is between the 30th and the 50th. And we have a lot of hills, and that's great for winemaking, especially if you have a grape like Sangiovese, which is very site specific. So hills are definitely prevalent inland in the Chianti area, for example, and down towards Montalcino, you have Monte Amiata, which is a very large extinct volcano. And then in the north as well, in Arezzo, so we have a lot of different hills. 25% is mountain region, and not very important for wine because it's too cool and too wet. We have a few wineries that are trying and doing a good job, especially with Pinot Noir and Chardonnay grapes. Then we have the plains, and the plains comprise both the Arno Valley that goes through the northern part of Tuscany and out to the seaside, so basically from Arezzo, Firenze, and Pisa. And then we have some plains in the south, in Maremma, which is our Wild West. And down there we have a little bit of winemaking, even with the Sangiovese. Our surrounding regions are Liguria to the northwest, with the Cinque Terre. Then we have to our north Emilia-Romagna, with the fantastic foods like balsamic vinegar, aceto balsamico di Modena, Parmigiano Reggiano, and of course prosciutto di Parma, and much more. Le Marche is to our east. It's a beautiful area also, wonderful both for reds and white wines. Umbria is to our east, southeast. Umbria is a landlocked region, fantastic, very reminiscent of Tuscany, but less busy, let's say. And Lazio is to our south. Lazio is the region of the capital, Rome. Our climate is Mediterranean for sure, but of course varies from the coast, and as we get inland, it's definitely more continental. And also remember, another modifying fact is elevation, so which is very important in areas like Chianti and Montalcino and so forth. Our average temperatures lie between 12 and 15 degrees Celsius. And so, of course, this is an annual average. Right now, it's like really cold, but in the summer, it can get really scorching hot. So these are our averages. And again, they're averages in rainfall from 500 millimeters out by the seaside, and then deep into the hills or mountains, we can get up to 2,000. Our soils are sedimentary. You have to imagine that the sea covered most of the region millions of years ago. And so we have a lot of clay, limestone, and sandstone, and a lot of fossils around. Climatic challenges, apart from the obvious, so climate change, we have to deal with spring frost, which can be challenging, especially for the Sangiovese grape, which is an early budder. So it can often happen that in the beginning of April, when the little buds have just come out, we get one of those bad night frosts. And so the vines have to start over. Humidity can be an issue in early summer, and so that's another reason why we like to grow our vines on hills, so that we can get some breezes that come in and dry up the vines. However, in certain areas, we need to spray a bit of copper and sulfur to combat the mildews, even though, of course, these are heavy metals and go into the ground. And so it's something that some vintners are trying to deal with in other ways. Drought can be a problem. Maremma, for example, is an area that doesn't get a lot of rain. So depending on how the soil composition is and if it can retain the water that it gets during the winter season, we may have some drought. It is not customary to find irrigation systems in Tuscany. For some areas, for the DOCGs, it's not even allowed. Hail can be an issue as well, but of course it's very localized. So it may be a part of a vineyard that is, however, totally devastated, but it won't affect a whole region. And just a few pictures to show you the beauty and some details. This is Chianti Classico in the winter, and believe me, you don't want to get stuck up there if it snows. It's very hard to navigate. We're not used to that, and the roads are very windy. An example of the soil, Galestro and Albarese are two typical soils that you find in Chianti Classico. And then we have the Val d'Orcia Valley to show you, which is such a beautiful place. It's in between Montalcino and Montepulciano, and here it's looking south on the Monte Amiata, that large extinct volcano. It's a modifying fact climatically to Montalcino. And then I told you about the fossils, so I wanted you to see that it's real. This one was found on the southern side of Montalcino. And now I want to show you a little bit the regions, so that you can really get to become a little bit more familiar with the geography. As you can see, there are different colors on the map, and they correspond to a DOCG wine region. And we have 11 of those in Tuscany. So a pretty nice concentration of high quality winemaking areas. DOCs are 41, and on my map, they are gray, and they're not distinct just because a lot of them do overlap each other and even overlap inside of the DOCG regions. IGTs don't have a color on the map. IGT you can produce pretty much everywhere you want to, and there are 6 different names for the IGTs. The most common would be IGT Toscana, so simply a Tuscan wine. And again, for the IGT, the regulations are very few. Basically, you have to use a minimum of 85% of grapes growing within the specific region that you say you're growing it in. So Tuscany in this case. Most, of course, would use 100% grapes coming from their region, but it just gives a little bit more flexibility if somebody wants to purchase grapes from, say, Sicily and put them into their wine. But that could be a max of 15%. I just want to take you through the different provinces. We have 10 different provinces in Tuscany, and they take their name from the biggest village or town in their area. So I'm going to start in the north, in the top part of our map, northwest, with Massa. Massa is a city on the seaside, but it's also up against the Apennine Mountains, where there's a lot of excavation for marble. Lucca is in the valley. Lucca is a beautiful walled town that if you haven't visited, you should. It's gorgeous. To the south of Lucca is Pisa, which is also in the valley. Here we're in the Valdarno Valley. And Pisa, of course, doesn't need an introduction because everybody knows the wonderful Leaning Tower. To the south of Pisa, we have Livorno. Livorno is an important port on the seaside. And this is where, for example, the cruise ships stop when they come visit in Tuscany. Then we have inland 3 bigger towns, Pistoia, Prato, and of course Firenze. Firenze, which is the capoluogo, so the capital of Tuscany, and that's where I am right now. Arezzo is to the southeast of us, also a really nice town to visit. Siena is straight south and is within the Chianti Senesi region, and also really close to Montepulciano and Montalcino, that are the green and blue areas on my map. I'm going to come back to that. The last provincia is Grosseto, which is down in Maremma to the very south. And it's the only town down there because it's a very rural area, so not hugely populated, but very popular during summer months for vacation. So I want to go through the regions that have a DOCG so that you can know where they are and what they are. Some of them I have a slide on later on, so I'm going to go into more detail. And those are the more traditional or more famous. And others I don't, so then I'll just mention them really quickly right now. San Gimignano is the yellow region on the map. And this is the only region that produces a DOCG white wine in Tuscany. It was actually one of the first regions to get the DOC recognition. So the first bottles coming out with DOC was in 1966. This is the home of Vernaccia di San Gimignano, a specific grape that only grows there. Chianti is next. Chianti is pretty big. As you can see, it's the pink area, and it's so big that it's been divided into sub-regions. The sub-regions are 7, and they are all around, so I'll quickly mention them. Here in Florence, right next to us, is Chianti Fiorentini. So Colli means hills, and Fiorentini, of course, refers to Florence. To the west of us, where you also see the tiny little violet area, you have Chianti Montalbano, which overlaps with Carmignano, but I'll get back to that. Out by Pisa, you have Chianti Colli Pisani. So that kind of says itself. We have Chianti Montespertoli, which going down towards the yellow area is the smallest Chianti subregion and also one of the newest. Then we can come down to Siena, and we have Chianti Senesi, which actually goes all the way down to Montalcino and to Montepulciano. Then we have Chianti Aretini, close to Arezzo. And then just northeast of Florence, we have Chianti Ruffina. And that is considered one of the more important subregions of Chianti because it's kind of high up in the mountains and gives very good results. Then we have Chianti Classico, which is not a subregion of Chianti. So that's important. It's a separate region from Chianti, even though it's right next to it and it has the first name in common. It is separated in the fact that you cannot produce Chianti within Chianti Classico. You can produce only Chianti Classico. And so they're a little bit different. And even though they both use the Sangiovese grape, the whole geography of Chianti Classico is very different. And also the makeup of the wine is a little bit different. Montalcino is to the south, so the blue region that you can see on the map. And I have a separate slide on that, so I'm not going to just go over it quite quickly, but this is an area for 100% Sangiovese. Montepulciano, also one of the historical appellations, is also a Sangiovese-based wine appellation. I'll get back to it later. Then we have Carmignano that I briefly mentioned. Carmignano is the smallest of our DOCGs here in Tuscany, and actually one of the smallest of all of Italy. It counts something like 12 wineries. Anyhow, this is also an area where we find Sangiovese, but we also find some Cabernet, but I'm going to tell you more about it later. Scansano is to the south in Maremma, and together with Montecucco, that lies right north of it. Also, this area is for the growing of Sangiovese, but it's a warmer region down there, so more fruity expressions of Sangiovese for sure. Elba is the island that is well known for the exile of Napoleon, but they have their own grape as well, Aliatico, which is lovely when it's air dried and then made into a dessert wine. So that is what they have a DOCG for. The grape is called Aliatico. Suvereto and Val di Cornia are on the Etruscan coast, and they're right next to Bulgari that I do have a slide on. But Bulgari is more famous than Suvereto and Val di Cornia, but ironically doesn't have a DOCG, just a DOC. However, in common, these regions specialize in using international grape varieties. So you find a lot of blends coming from the areas with, for example, Cabernet and Merlot and Syrah and so forth. And talking about the grapes. Now, Italy has a huge patrimony of native grapes, more than 500 on the national registry, 100 of which can be found within the borders of Tuscany. So it's quite extraordinary. Tuscany is climatically, historically, culturally a red wine region. So around 80% of all the wine produced is a red. Out of these 100 different grapes, not a lot of them actually get a lot of mention, because we have a grape that is so strong and so beloved and so fabulous, which is the Sangiovese, that the other ones sort of get a little bit set to the side. But I'll mention a few of them here just because it's fun. So we have Sangiovese, of course, which I have a separate slide on, so I'm not going to dwell further into that right now. Canaiolo is a blending grape to Sangiovese. So it was one of those grapes that were in the field and got blended in, and it actually does really well. So it's still part of the Chianti Classico blend, for example. Chile Giallo is another lovely grape, which is related to Sangiovese. It's either the father or the son of, they're not quite sure, but it appears it could be the father or mother. Together with another grape variety from southern Italy called Negro Dolce. Anyhow, Chile Giallo is a good blending partner with Sangiovese, but can also stand alone, and you find it in the southern part of Tuscany, on the other side of the Monte Amiata, so basically down towards Lazio. There's a region that does the Chile Giallo in a pure expression, which is really nice. Colorino is another blending grape for Sangiovese that adds color, hence the name. In fact, some of the Colorino varieties have color in the pulp, so it's a really colorful variety. Mammolo, on the other hand, you don't find a lot of it, but it's still worth mentioning it because it's part of the historical blend of Vino Nobility di Montepulciano that we'll get to later. Aliatico, already mentioned, it's from Elba, and it gives these beautiful aromatic dessert wines. Italian whites that we want to talk about. Trebbiano. Trebbiano is one of the most grown white grapes around Italy, and it even grows in France under the name of Ugni Blanc. Trebbiano is one of those grapes that are easy to grow and very prolific, and so it gives volume, but it's difficult that it gives much character. And so today it's used either for the Vinsanto, so the dessert wine, because it's good for drying. And some producers are trying to make whites out of the Trebbiano with some skin maceration. Malvasia is another historical blending grape for the Sangiovese, but no longer used very much. In Chianti Classico, it's not allowed, and in Chianti, more and more producers are heading towards using only red grapes. So it's still used in the Vinsanto that we'll see later on. Vernaccia is only in San Gimignano. So we're talking Vernaccia di San Gimignano, of course, because there's other Vernaccias in Italy, of course. But they are not related to this Vernaccia, so they have nothing to do with each other. Vermentino comes from Sardinia, but also grows really well in Tuscany, but it's a coastal variety, so we find it mainly out by the seaside, which is perfect because that's where we eat a lot of fish and we need the white wine to go with it. Moscato is found all over Italy as well, but in Tuscany it has a long tradition in Montalcino, where before the Brunello, the Muscatello di Montalcino was the famous wine. Today, it's not produced in very large amounts because Brunello has become world famous, and so it doesn't get the light of day, basically. Ansonica is another coastal grape that I like to mention because I like the wines very much. Especially the ones coming from the little tiny island of Giglio. So very, very big whites and important whites with a lot of structure and depth. And so really interesting, not cheap, but worth it. The international grapes make up for about 20%, and most are red. And these grapes made it into our region in the past 40 years or so, especially during the sort of super Tuscan rage. So you will find Merlot, Cabs, Shiraz or Syrah, Petit Verdot, and Pinot Noir in various areas around Tuscany. Some of them are used to blend with Sangiovese. So Sangiovese is certainly a grape that is happy to be blended with. But of course, strong grapes like Merlot and Cab and Syrah doesn't take much to overpower the delicate character of the Sangiovese. And for the whites, we find a little bit of Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, and Pinot Grigio. Here you can see the cake that Sangiovese really beats them all. It takes more than half of the cake. So Merlot, Cab, Trebbiano, Vermentino, and so forth. Well, we got to talk a little bit about Sangiovese, the king of grapes of Tuscany, but also the most grown red grape variety in Italy. It's in Tuscany, though, that it's found its perfect habitats. Because it's very site-specific, it expresses itself quite differently from place to place. And so it's found a few places here in Tuscany where it has become famous. Now, there's many different clones of the grape variety. Most of them come with a number, so we're not going to talk about which ones they are. However, clones are basically selections of the better vines. So trying to always get the characteristics that we're looking for. You can see, for example, on the picture that the Sangiovese grape bunch is really tight, and that can create problems towards harvest time with the bunch rot. And so that's one of the things that the clone research has done. It's trying to find ways of reducing perhaps those clutterings of grapes. A few more characteristics about the Sangiovese. So it's a little difficult to cultivate, which is surprising because it's so prevalent in Italy. But it does require a lot of care from the vintner to manage the growth and the quality of the grape. Because it's very prolific, it needs to be pruned quite severely. So both winter pruning is important, but also in certain places, it might be important to do some green harvesting towards July. So thinning out the bunches to make sure that the vine grows the correct amount for the kind of quality that we're looking for. It's quite vigorous. So choosing the right site is very important. It's important that we have good drainage in the soil and that the soil retains the water during the hot growing season, since it's not allowed for the main part to drip feed or to use irrigation in the vineyards. Also, we need to be usually in a very sunny site because it is a variety that needs a lot of sun hours. So south exposition is quite important. And also we like hilly areas because that way we can use the natural breezes that will come in and dry up the grapes. We already mentioned it's early to bud in the spring, and it's one of the latest to ripen. So usually harvest is by the end of September and could even go into the month of October, depending on the year. And this, of course, means that we have hazards that we have to look out for, because at that point, the grapes, the skins of the grapes are very thin and so susceptible to hail, but also, of course, to rot. It is luckily drought resistant, so there is something positive. Now, when we talk about the wine characteristics themselves, in the glass of Sangiovese, depending, of course, on the site and the all of the different determining facts, but generally speaking, we could say that it's a wine that gives medium color. The color is not super stable, which means that even after just a couple of years, it will start to turn. So we'll get from a more violet and ruby, we'll get those orange, more garnet colors. The wine is usually very high in acidity, which is great because they're designed to accompany food, so they need to have a nice freshness to them. There's a medium-high tannin level, and tannin is another of the building structure of a wine, so it's important to have. But that also means that often we need to wait a couple of years to enjoy the wines, because sometimes they can be really astringent in your mouth. And another thing that I didn't put on is that the alcohol level is also usually pretty medium high. So depending a little bit on the area, we get wines from 12 to 14.5 in alcohol. That's important too. That's also one of the building stones. And at the end of the day, we're looking at regions that are producing high-end wines, and so wines that are worth aging. And so it's important to have all of these elements. Flavor-wise, that's also a difficult one because it really can change depending on site, winemaking method, all sorts of things. But of course, there's some generalizations to be made. So prevalent fruit flavors are cherries and plum. Cherries, all sorts, like from red cherries to black cherries to cherry jam sometimes. It can be quite earthy in the flavor, as well as a sort of licorice note to it, black licorice, sometimes some underbrush. And as the wine ages in the bottle, you will get flavors that are less fruity, so the fruit will disappear slowly, and we'll get leather, cigar box, tobacco, truffle, those sort of things. And now I'm going to take you on a little bit of a trip around to a few of the most noteworthy or traditional wine regions around Tuscany. And we start with San Gimignano, which is this beautiful hilltop town that you can see with the towers in the background. Here we are in one of the highest elevated vineyards of the region. And this is a white wine region. I'm going to let Google Earth show you the surrounding landscape of San Gimignano, where we find around 70 different wineries. The town itself is one of the ones that are high on the list for visitors. It's well known because of its medieval towers. I think it's 11 or 12 or 13 of which are still standing, and there used to be like over 70. These are tower houses that were built in the 11 or 1200s by striding families who were wanting to show their importance and power by building the highest towers. We'll go to the slide of Vernaccia di San Gimignano, which I already mentioned is growing only here in San Gimignano, even though it has been found to be completely identical to a grape variety in Liguria called Picarbon. And then there is the hypothesis that Vernaccia actually comes from the village of Vernazza in the Cinque Terre in Liguria. So that's a possibility, that it migrated and went to San Gimignano and found its perfect little paradise there. San Gimignano is often called the island in the sea of red because all the other wine regions are reds. San Gimignano is under the sea, and so the soil is full of fossils. So you can go for a walk and find shells, and it's quite amazing. The wine itself, the DOCG regulation, requires wineries to use the Vernaccia for at least 85% of the wine. It can be a blend, though, with up to 15% of other non-aromatic grapes. And that's because Vernaccia itself is not hugely aromatic, so we don't want to go and cover up the delicate flavors that it gives. There are two versions. Now here you have a Vernaccia. This is one of the ones that you might find in the tasting pack. So yeah, it's a DOCG wine, and you'll find that also on the label somewhere where it's written out in its total beauty. So Vernaccia di San Gimignano, denominazione di origine controllata e garantita. It's not such a mouthful, we just call it DOCG. This is a vintage, so this is the youngest that you'll find on the market, usually released just before summer, because it is the perfect Tuscan summer wine. But the grape itself is a little tannic, and so it can also withstand some aging. And so in San Gimignano, you'll find the Riserva for wines that have aged a little bit in oak and are meant for a longer aging in your cellar. So that's quite an interesting wine. And so, of course, when we talk about the vintage, it's a very fresh and delightful, very easy wine for fish dishes, or for rabbit, as they like to cook it in San Gimignano, with saffron. Whereas if we look at the Riserva, of course, we're looking at a wine that has way more structure. It's also a little bit more golden in color. And so those are wines that are more important for stronger foods, basically. So you could even like pair them with cheeses. The area has other wines as well. So when you go visit one of these wineries, you'll find, of course, the Vernaccia is the star of the region, but you may also find red wines and other colors of wines. You have the Chianti Senesi, which overlaps with Vernaccia di San Gimignano, and then you have a specific DOC in the region called San Gimignano DOC. And this DOC allows for a lot of different wine styles. I want to mention that this is an old grape variety. Even Dante Alighieri knew about it. He was in San Gimignano in the year 1300s, and the Vernaccia stuck to his mind because later on he wrote about it in the Divine Comedy. There was a bishop who was eating too many eels that were soaked in Vernaccia wine, and so he was sent to hell. So don't do that. Michelangelo even talks about Vernaccia. He describes it that it kisses, licks, bites, pinches, and stings. And so I love that. I think that's the greatest description. We should get back to talking about wines like that. I'm going to take you on a little aerial from Florence to Carmignano. So we start in central Florence, go through the flat plains of the Val d'Arno towards the Montalbano area, where we have the small hills of Carmignano, and of course the village, the appellation, the DOCG of Carmignano is here. Divided between 12 different wineries. It's one of the smallest areas of winemaking that we have, but also one of the oldest, as it was part of the Bando of 1716. And not strange, because the Medici family in the time between the 14 and the 1800s basically owned most of the land. So you find several Medici villas in this area. And this is one of those villas. This is the one in Poggio a Caiano, with the collection of still lives on the top floor. The extension of the influence of the Medicis in this area was substantial. They built a big wall, a very long wall, around the hills of Carmignano because they wanted to have it as their own private hunting reservoir. It's called the Parco Reale, and it now lends its name to one of the wines of the region. Legend also has it that Caterina de' Medici was the person to introduce Cabernet from France back already 500 years ago. And so the Cabernet has grown in the area for such a long time. In fact, it was renamed by the local farmers. They call it uva francesina, so the French grape. It's been here for such a long time that it's basically considered native. And so it was without doubt, when the DOCG was decided, the blend had to contain the Cabernet Sauvignon. So we have Sangiovese for a minimum of 50%, Cabernet Sauvignon or Cabernet Franc for a minimum of 10%. And there could be another blending grape like Canaiolo, but it's definitely a blend. There are two versions in this case as well. We have the vintage. Here you have an example. This is from Capezzana. So Carmignano usually could be released after 18 months, but those are minimums. In this case, for example, I've got the 2016, and it was just released this year. Riserva, on the other hand, has to age for a minimum of 3 years, but again, those are minimums. And these are robust reds. They're definitely designed for food. You want to open them while you're having a lovely dinner. So expect quite a lot of stuff going on in your glass. They're full-bodied wines usually. Other wines, as mentioned, the Parco Reale, which is a red as well, usually released as a more young style of wine, definitely a little bit of an everyday kind of wine, but really lovely as well. Rosato is also a DOC in this area, so Rosato means rosé in Italian. Vinsanto is another wonderful wine of the area. So Vinsanto is the dessert wine, and I'll be talking more about it later on, but basically, yeah, made from dried grapes. Only about 12 wineries in the region. It is so tiny. Chianti Classico, we go on to the next area. This is the one that's red on my map. I'm going to take you on a little trip from Florence to Siena so that you can get a feel for how big the region is. So we're starting in Florence. You can almost see my office. First village that we encounter is Grape in Chianti, down in the valley. Greve takes its name from the little river Greve. Then there's Panzano. Panzano is in the top of the hill. And you can see the vineyards around, but also a lot of forest land. Castellina in Chianti was part of the original Lega del Chianti and a part of the Bando from 1716, like Rada in Chianti and Gaiola in Chianti. You can kind of see the mounts of Chianti as well. And so about 10% of the total surface area of Chianti Classico is dedicated to vineyards. And here we're in Siena, so just outside of the Chianti Classico. So that's how big it is. And in fact, when we do tours to Chianti Classico from Florence, we tend to stay within the northern part of the area because it's just so large, you can't see it all. And even though you can drive through it in a day, no problem, it doesn't take more than a few hours. It's very windy, and so if you want to take your time and soak it up, you need to give it at least a few days to discover it all. So Chianti Classico is a really historical area. It's full of little castles and fortified buildings and monasteries, so really testifying to a long history. Wine, of course, has always been part of what was grown in Chianti Classico because it is a very hilly area and the soils are quite poor, so not much else will grow there, or rather with very big difficulty. So it's perfect for olives and vines. Chianti Classico has its own symbol, which is the black rooster, which you will find on every bottle of Chianti Classico. So it's on the neck, but it may also be found somewhere on the label. So the black rooster is a historical symbol, goes back to a legend from the Middle Ages, probably, when Florence and Siena were fighting each other and trying to determine who was to reign over which part of land. So they had a horse race that started early in the morning when the rooster crowed. Siena had a white rooster. Florence had a black rooster and tricked their black rooster into waking up earlier by holding a candle in front of him. So basically he crowed, the horseman rider started at midnight or so and got through the region and met the Sienese horseman rider right after dawn by the area of Fonterutoli, which is south of Castellina in Chianti. Since then, they've had the joy of calling the area Gallo Nero, which is, of course, Italian for the black rooster. Today, it's not called the Gallo Nero region, it's called Chianti Classico, but using the Gallo Nero symbol. Anyhow, there are around 350 different wineries in the region, from large to quite small, all of which can produce, of course, the Chianti Classico if they have the DOCG vineyards and if they use the Sangiovese for a minimum of 80%. So it's possible to blend up to 20% of other red grapes, either the native grapes, like the ones that we've seen, Canaiolo, Colorino, Chile Giallo, etc., or international grapes like Merlot or Cabernet Sauvignon. And that's totally up to the producer. Some will do 100% Sangiovese, others will choose to blend. So it's completely up to the winery, what kind of style they want to have. There are 3 versions of the Chianti Classico, and it's quite unique because usually there's 2. There's Vintage and Riserva, as you've seen on the other 2. But in Chianti Classico, you also have the Gran Selezione, which has come around about 10 years ago. And Gran Selezione is to symbolize a wine that ages for a little bit longer than the Riserva, and it must come from the winery's own vineyards. Of course, because of these regulations and because also of the great vastness of the area, there are quite a few different styles, but definitely we're talking a dry wine, medium to full-bodied, structured, age-worthy, beautiful wines. I am in love with Chianti Classico. Other wines produced in the region, Vinsanto del Chianti Classico, which is the dessert wine, or the wineries would have to go into the IGT production. So a lot of wineries do, because of course it's great to produce the wine of the region, but it's also fun to have fun, to do your own stuff, to experiment. And so there's quite a lot of IGTs in the region, even some that are super famous. So those super Tuscans that we talked about before. And also a little bit of white production, but it's very contained. Montepulciano is a hilltop town in the southeast of Tuscany, and it's a really beautiful region, beautiful town, really hilly. So wear good shoes if you do go visit. And of course, it's a wonderful historical town with history also of winemaking. You'll find old cellars that go in underground inside the city walls. It's quite something. And around, of course, we have the different wineries. So I'm going to show you what it might look like if you were to fly in on a Google camera. There we go. It's a bit grainy, but you get the idea. So here you have the village on the top of the hill and the fields around, and you get to see also the plain. Actually, you can see the Lago Trasimeno, which is a lake that borders with Umbria, and the Val di Chiana, which is a valley area. Here we go. Those are the vineyards, the olive groves, etc., etc. And in the background is the Val d'Orcia, famous also for cheese, pecorino cheese. So the Vino Nobile di Montepulciano is the DOCG of the area. And you can see that the area is divided into 2. So there's the main part that is around the village as we saw it. And then there's a tiny little part up to the northeast. And basically there is just a valley in between. So the valley area, as we mentioned, is not ideal for the growing of Sangiovese, because this is indeed a Sangiovese based wine. Even though you may have heard of another grape called Montepulciano, which you would think grows in Montepulciano, but it does not, just to be naughty, I guess. So Montepulciano, the grape, will grow in Abruzzo, which is on the Adriatic side, and a little bit more southern than Tuscany. Also a lovely grape, but has nothing to do with the Vino Nobile. Vino Nobile means noble wine of Montepulciano, and often we do shorten it and we just call it Nobile. So minimum Sangiovese content of this wine is 70%, up to 30% of blending grapes. Again, we're talking mainly Canaiolo, Mammolo, and these kind of grapes. But it's possible to use various red grapes as well. So a little bit like the Chianti Classico, it is a possible blend. Some will produce a Nobile from just Sangiovese, and that is also possible. There are around 80 wineries in the region, so it's not a super large area, and it's a really nice area to visit. You will get two versions of the Vino Nobile. So we're back to normal. There's no Gran Selezione. We have the vintage, which ages for a minimum of 2 years. And then we have the Riserva, which ages for a minimum of 3. And here we have one that we put in our tasting pack from the Boscarelli winery in Montepulciano, which of course is one of the best, in my opinion. We have another red wine in the region, which is Rosso Di Montepollano, which is a 1-year-old wine. Now, the Rosso di Montepulciano can come from its own vineyards, so there will be DOC vineyards dedicated just to that, but it could also be a degrading of the Vino Nobile, because if in 1 year you don't have the best selection of grapes and you're not really happy, you don't want to make your top wines, you can degrade them, you can declassify them and make the lower wine. It's the younger wine, let's call it that, because it's actually super nice. Of course, in terms of style in the area, it's not too far off from Chianti Classico. Now, Chianti Classico is a region that is higher lying, so it has more temperature excursions between night and day, and so you'll get a little bit more austerity, a little bit more acidity in Chianti Classico. Montepulciano tends to be a bit softer in the expression, but of course we're talking Sangiovese, we're talking Tuscany, they're not that far apart, they're not two worlds apart. They're both beautiful wines from Sangiovese. Vinsanto di Montepulciano is also not to be forgotten. Actually, one of the first wines in Italy to ever receive 100 points from the Wine Spectator was a Vinsanto from Montepulciano, from the Avignonesi winery. And we head to the next region. Neighboring Montepulciano is Montalcino. So to distinguish the two, I often hear Montepulciano, and that does not exist. So Montalcino, which is on the west side of the beautiful Val d'Orcia that you can see from this vineyard on the northern side of Montalcino. Let's fly in. This time we get to see where Italy is. Here we go. And Tuscany. You can see also the big lakes. Okay, and so here we are over Montalcino. Again, we're talking a hilltop village, and you can see how close the Monte Amiata is in the south. And here we're going around, we're now heading from the western side to the southern side of Montalcino. The west has a lot of forest. The south is favored in cooler years. The northern side is favored in warmer years. So you do have different expressions around Montalcino, a lot of different microclimates. And there's about 200 wineries that call Montalcino home. So a lot of them are quite small because it is a small region. So Brunello di Montalcino is the name that these 200 wineries share. And in order to do so, of course, they have to have their vineyards within Montalcino. Now, there's about 2,000 square hectares in Montalcino that can produce this wonderful wine. A wine that has reached notoriety, is famous for being one of the most important wines of Italy. And it's only really rivaled by Barolo in Piemonte for being one of those wines that can age for decades. So what is it that makes Montalcino so special? Well, a combination of facts again, a combination of lucky facts. It's one of those areas where Sangiovese has basically found itself where it can actually ripen really well. And compared to Montepulciano and Chianti Classico and Carmignano that we've looked at, these are areas that either are blends or could be blends. And that is basically because Sangiovese could have trouble ripening and we need to add something to make it a nice wine. That's not the case in Montalcino. In Montalcino, 100% Sangiovese, pure wines always. Another super special characteristic of Brunello is its very long aging. It's basically 5 years old before it goes on the market. So right now we have the 2015 on the market. And very soon we'll have the 2016. So with the 2021, that can't come fast enough. This very long aging, so at least 2 years in an oak barrel, at least, these are minimums, and a few months also in the bottle, makes it such a wine that it can resist time, so that it can mature in the bottle even longer. So it's up to you when you buy a Brunello. You can drink it right away. Nobody's gonna, call it infanticide. But if you have patience, you will be rewarded. Usually the best time to drink a Brunello is after 10 years of aging from harvest. So possibly be patient. There are other wines in the region. Now, of course, Reserva, I didn't mention it because by now you know it has to age for an extra year, and of course would only be made in the exceptional years. Rosso di Montalcino is the younger version. It's a little bit like the Rosso di Montepulciano in Montepulciano, hence a 1-year-old wine made with the same kind of grapes, so Sangiovese, either from specific Rosso di Montalcino designated vineyards or degraded or declassified DOCG Brunello vineyards. I love Rosso di Montalcino. It's a beautiful wine, really approachable, even when it's young, a real great food wine. Sant'Antimo DOC is a little bit like the San Gimignano DOC that we saw in San Gimignano, hence an appellation that is only used in Montalcino, but for a variety of wines. So you'll find white wines, red wines from different kinds of grapes. So it's a bit hard to define what it is, but it's from Montalcino. And Sant'Antimo is the name of a beautiful abbey that is to be found in the countryside of Montalcino, which of course you'll see if you come on grape tours, wine tour to Montalcino. Muscatello di Montalcino, I mentioned it briefly before. It's not something you encounter a lot in Montalcino because it's simply not made a lot anymore, but it's made from Moscato grapes and can be white, dry, or dessert wine version. And now we leave the inland, historical, Sangiovese-based appellations, and we head up to the seaside. So you can see the Mediterranean, the Tyrrhenian Sea out there. This is Bulgari, and Bulgari is a new area that has come around in the past 50 years or so. Practically thanks to a guy, Mario Incisa della Rocchetta, who decided to plant Cabernet in the area. He was fascinated by Bordeaux and thought that this could be a resembling area, being on the seaside as it is, and pretty flat. His provision was definitely right. And so here you have some of the more noteworthy super Tuscan style wines. Of course, we don't really call them that, but you have the blends of Cabernet, Merlot, produced in this area. Some of them are very famous, of course, like the Sassicaia, so the original wine of the area, but you also have Ornellaia, owned by the Frescobaldi family. You have the Antinoris who have come in and make wine. You have Gaia who came in and makes wine. So definitely some really important names in the area, along with, of course, smaller wineries that are doing a pretty great job as well. Let's just fly in over the area and see what it looks like. So you have the mountains, but they're in the background. And so it's a flat area with 2 villages, Bulgari and Castagneto Carducci, and all the grapevines that are down in the flatland. So this picture is from the Cyprus laned road really famous. It's at least 5 kilometers long and goes from the Tenuta San Guido, so the Sassicaia winery, the original one, all the way up to the village of Bulgari. On either side, you have vineyards, and they're dedicated mainly, of course, to the international grape varieties that I already mentioned. So Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, you'll find Merlot, you'll find Petit Verdot, etc., etc. For the whites, there's Vermentino, of course, because we're out by the coast, and there's some Viognier as well. The DOC came along pretty late because at the time people were happy to produce these super Tuscan styles as table wines. The IGT, of course, was introduced also in the 90s, and Bulgari Sassicaia, the DOC, was given as a merit to the Tenuta San Guido, but of course they're the only ones that can produce Sassicaia. Bulgari Superiore DOC is usually for the top wines of the wineries, so outside, of course, of the Tenuta San Guido. And so you'll find both appellations in use, Bulgari DOC and Bulgari Superiore DOC. Show you one that is a typical Bulgari wine, Bulgari Rosso DOC. This is a blend. I believe inside you have some Cabernet, Merlot, and perhaps a tiny little bit of Sangiovese, it's possible. And last but not least, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Vinsanto, because we've mentioned it. I told you it's a dessert wine, but it's really a magical wine that's been produced the same way for centuries. And it's not made by so many wineries because, well, it's not a great economic venture for sure. You lose something like 80% of the volume over the years when you produce this wine. But let me just take you through the steps real quick. So after harvest, we put the grapes, and they can be either Malvasia, or Trebbiano, Pulcinculo, Grechetto. These different white grapes or Sangiovese can also be used. However, they're put on these bamboo trays or shelves to dry out for 3 to 4 months. And sometimes you'll also find them hanging from the ceiling. The goal, of course, is to reduce the amount of water that we have inside of the grapes and to transform the flavors so that we get these beautiful dried raisiny flavors. After the drying process, the grapes are selected. If there's any rotten grape, it needs to be taken away. And then we press. The juice goes into small barrels made either out of oak or chestnut or cherry, sweet woods. And then they're not filled up completely to the top because we want a little bit of air in there. And then they're cemented. They're locked because otherwise they might pop during fermentation. Fermentation happens during summer, and because there's so much sugar in this wine or in the juice, it'll take quite a while for the yeasts to work. So they're working quite slowly and usually over a couple of years. When we reach an alcohol level that is so high that the yeasts are starting to fatigue in doing their job, they simply hang out on the bottom. They become sediment and just stick around. And usually that part of the wine we call the mother. So after several years, minimum 3, but often much longer, 5, 7, 10 years sometimes, the barrels are opened and the magic is discovered. Because it's not ever sure, like you know what has been going on. Nothing's controlled in this process, but it's an oxidative aging. So of course the wine is sort of orange in color, as you can see right there. They're taking the wine out into a tank and then to be bottled. And so the result is a beautiful semi-sweet to sweet dessert wine. that you can enjoy after dinner or with cheese. Some like it with liver, but usually it has a beautiful taste of caramel, of dried fruits, and it's nice and thick and really covers your palate. It's amazing. Traditionally, it is served with the cantucci biscotti. So it is a tradition to have that after dinner and dip the biscotti, because they're very hard, into the wine. You'll find that often as a dessert in the restaurants. Beware that often they don't serve a real Vinsanto, because real Vinsanto is pretty expensive. So of course, I'm not talking about the very good restaurants, but usually there is a cheaper version of a Vinsanto style called Vino Liquoroso. It cannot be called Vinsanto, so you have to look at the label to see what it is. So that's it. Usually bottled in smaller bottles like this, because of course of the cost of the wine itself and the fact that you don't drink a whole bottle in one evening. The great thing about Vinsanto is that you can keep the bottle open for quite a long time, as it's already oxidized. And this takes us to the very end. So thank you so much. I hope you guys liked the presentation a little bit. At least learned something. I know it's very long, but this is what we usually do in our wine class. So check out our stuff. We have the wine school, so you can do more wine education. You can start from scratch. You can do something a little bit more advanced with the Wine Scholar Guild. We also have the wine shop, so you can ship wine to yourself or somebody you like from our shop. And also you can pass by when you're in Florence. We sell wines right here. Of course, the wine tours, check those out as well. We'd love to see you. So whatever you do, follow, do give us a like for the video if you will. Even follow the channel. I'd be really happy. And yeah, here's the link to the tasting pack that of course I will put below. So you can choose 6 different bottles of the ones that we have been talking about and have them shipped directly to your home so that you can taste what I've been talking about. Thank you for joining me. Do leave a comment if you have any questions below. I'll definitely get back to you.